The entire nation watched in stunned silence as Carson stared at a single, crumpled piece of paper, tears streaming down his face. The secret message was only 12 words long, but it cost Carson his unflappable mask and redefined the meaning of his entire career. While Johnny Carson prepared, Arthur wrestled with a tide of paper that threatened to drown the entire building. His domain, the mailroom, smelled faintly of stale cardboard. Arthur was 55, quiet and reliable, a fixture so unassuming that to the stars he was simply the absence of mail on their desk. His job was less about delivering notes and more about triage, filtering thousands of pieces of junk, strange demands, and occasional fan art. He had seen it all: threats, wedding rings, snakes, and had mastered the art of being emotionally detached. But tonight, Arthur was not detached. He hadn't slept well in weeks. The simple act of stamping envelopes reminded him of the ticking clock that governed his life. Just beneath his sorting tray was a worn photo of his son, Michael, and every time he glanced at it, the weight of the world returned. Michael's rare heart condition was advancing rapidly. The time Arthur was allowed with the boy was precious and heartbreakingly limited. He had to work this shift. The insurance premiums were astronomical. So Arthur worked, using the dull reality of the mailroom as a temporary shield against his family's impending grief. He opened a sack marked personal fan mail and began sifting through the usual clutter. Then his fingers brushed against something else, small, heavy, and firm, wrapped in thick brown butcher paper. It felt homemade. It was addressed simply to Mr. Johnny Carson, NBC Studios, Burbank. The address was written in careful, slightly shaky cursive, the handwriting of a 9-year-old. It was taped with excessive amounts of clear packing tape, secured like a precious cargo. This one was different. It didn't look like an attempt at fame or a cry for money. It looked like an offering. Arthur carried the small package over to his desk light. He felt a sudden, profound dread in his chest, an emotional pull he hadn't experienced in years. He knew, with the chilling certainty only a father in pain can possess, that whatever was inside this humble wrapping paper carried a burden far heavier than the rest of the night's mail combined. He gently, almost reverently, began peeling back the tape. He was about to break the seal on a secret that Johnny Carson was never meant to see, a secret that would shake the very foundations of the king of late night's composure. Arthur Hayes had spent 15 years building a fortress around his heart, but the instant he felt the texture of the small, hand-carved wooden gift, he knew that the fortress was about to crumble. The weight of the object was heavy with purpose, and it landed on his desk with a quiet thud that echoed the painful truth he carried. This was no ordinary piece of fan mail. The outer wrapping paper gave way easily. Security demanded he check every gift, but he slowed down for this one. When the last layer of paper fell away, he saw it, a tiny, hand-carved wooden replica of the famous Tonight Show microphone. It was about 6 inches high, imperfect, carved with the earnest, clumsy effort of small hands. The edges were uneven, but the intent was unmistakable. Tied around the base with ordinary white string was a single, folded note. Arthur's chest tightened. He picked up the thin, worn paper and unfolded it gently. He read the first 2 words, and his breath hitched. He closed his eyes for a long moment, fighting a wave of nausea and unbearable sorrow. The note had pierced his professional shield instantly, finding the deepest, most vulnerable place in his soul. The few lines spoke of a child's adoration for Johnny, not as a celebrity, but as a source of stability in the darkest of times. They spoke of quiet nights spent watching the television set when the world outside the hospital room was too scary. Arthur recognized the language immediately. It was the language of families managing limited time, of small, sweet gestures made when grand pronouncements were useless. He looked down at the wooden microphone, then at the note, and his entire professional composure dissolved. The emotional weight was too much to bear in his brightly lit mailroom. This was a private moment, a testament of love and fading hope, and it could not be witnessed. Arthur's eyes began to sting. He had to move. He couldn't be found here, caught in profound, personal grief over a stranger's child. Arthur quickly gathered the microphone, the note, and the wrapping paper. He needed air. Clutching the gift to his chest, he slipped out of the mailroom door and into the deserted hallway. He walked 300 feet down the cold concrete corridor, past the sound stages, and stopped at a plain steel fire exit. He pressed his forehead against the cold door, the little wooden microphone biting into his sternum, and finally, silently, let the sorrow wash over him. Everyone who watched The Tonight Show thought they knew Johnny Carson, but the man who wandered the labyrinthine halls of Studio One after the last guest left was a different, quieter soul. It was this habit of isolation that led him past the staff fire exit where, tonight, the silence was ruined by a sound more devastating than any studio argument. The ragged, controlled grief of a grown man fighting with everything he had not to cry. Johnny was heading to a rarely used dressing room on the lowest floor, preferring the cool anonymity of the maintenance corridors over the executive buzz. As he rounded a corner, he stopped dead. Leaning against the plain steel fire exit door, silhouetted in the low emergency lighting, was the male clerk, Arthur Hayes. Arthur was slumped forward, his shoulders trembling with an intensity that spoke of total defeat, letting the sheer, crushing weight of his sorrow pin him to the wall. Clutched tight against his chest were two small items, a crumpled piece of paper and a strangely shaped wooden object. Johnny, who could silence 20 million viewers with a single raised eyebrow, approached with a softness alien to his public persona. He was in a comfortable cardigan, looking every bit the Midwestern neighbor. He didn't make a joke or offer a platitude. He just stood there, respecting the sheer magnitude of the man's exposed vulnerability. Arthur didn't notice him until Johnny's shoes clicked softly on the polished linoleum. Arthur instantly jolted upright, his eyes wide with panic and mortification. The king of late night had caught him utterly undone. "Mr. Carson," Arthur whispered, quickly wiping his face. I'm sorry, sir. I was just taking a break." He tried to smooth his uniform, but his hands were shaking too badly, tightening his grip on the wooden object. Johnny simply looked at him, at the tears tracking through the dust on his face, at the trembling hands. He saw something real, authentic, and devastating. "It's all right, Arthur," Johnny said, his voice low and entirely stripped of his legendary wit. He took a single step closer and gestured toward the items clutched to Arthur's chest. "What is this?" Johnny asked. The question hung in the stale air, simple, direct, and non-negotiable. It wasn't an accusation, it was the only way to break the suffocating silence. Arthur knew he should lie, but staring into the unexpected sincerity of Carson's eyes, he realized he couldn't. This quiet, persistent question was his cue. He had to show him the secret he held. Arthur Hayes knew that telling a lie would be easier, more professional, and less humiliating, but the quiet authority in Johnny Carson's gaze demanded the truth, forcing Arthur to confront the secret that had been slowly crushing him for months. With a deep, shuddering breath, the invisible man began to speak about the only thing that truly mattered in his life: his boy. "It's from my son, Mr. Carson," Arthur whispered, his voice cracking on the final word. He quickly unfolded the little note and held it out, his hand shaking so violently the paper fluttered. "His name is Michael. He's 9. He's got a bad heart, a terminal illness. The doctors say our time is very limited now." He paused, battling the rising sorrow, then explained why he was holding the fan mail. "He asked me to mail it. He didn't want it to feel like a handout or something from an employee. He wanted you to get it just like everyone else. He wanted it to be real fan mail." Johnny took the note. He didn't look at Arthur, but focused entirely on the small piece of paper, respecting the gravity of the offering. He didn't rush. He opened the fragile sheet, his long, famous fingers carefully avoiding the edges. Arthur watched as the king of late night read the childish cursive script, the words written with painstaking effort. Arthur watched the legendary composure, the famous Carson Cool, begin to crack around the edges. Johnny Carson stared at those words for a long, quiet moment, reading them once, then twice, the silence of the corridor absorbing all the noise and celebrity of the evening. The 12 words were, "I made you this for the laughter I hear when I'm too tired to laugh." He had interviewed presidents and legends, but none of them had ever given him a line as profound or as terrifying as that. Laughter for the tired heart, it became his new personal mantra. The effect was instantaneous and profound. Johnny looked up, and the famous glint of wit in his eye was completely gone, replaced by a devastating recognition of a father's pain. He didn't have to ask why Arthur was crying. The note explained everything. It wasn't a request for a favor or a photo op. It was a heartfelt thank you from a little boy who, at the end of his life, was most grateful that his father still had a reason to smile. "He watches the show every night, sir," Arthur confessed, his voice steadying slightly, finding strength in the shared sorrow. "Since his condition worsened, he can't go to school. He spends most nights in bed or sometimes the local hospital, but at 11:30 we turn you on. Sometimes he's too weak to even move his lips to giggle. But he watches me. When I laugh at your monologue, he feels better. He knows, just for a moment, I'm okay. He calls the show Papa's Medicine." Arthur's explanation that the vast, public phenomenon that was The Tonight Show had been quietly repurposed in one single home as a private lifeline was the final blow. Johnny Carson, the man who thrived on fame and acclaim, was suddenly confronted with the true, humbling measure of his worth. Not the ratings or the guest list, but his accidental ability to give one overworked, heartbroken mail clerk a few minutes of relief, thereby comforting his small son. Johnny tucked the note carefully into the breast pocket of his cardigan, right over his heart. He looked at Arthur Hayes, the invisible man, and then at the little wooden microphone. "Arthur," Johnny said, his voice rough with emotion, "you are not going to worry about this alone anymore." The king of late night suddenly had a mission far more important than comedy. He had a family to protect. If this story of hidden kindness and the true meaning of fame touched your heart, hit that subscribe button. We bring you these intimate, heartwarming moments from behind the Hollywood curtain every week. Johnny Carson didn't bother walking back to the lavish executive suites. Instead, he strode quickly down the corridor to a rarely used phone booth near the stage manager's office, the small piece of paper pressed against his breast pocket like an ironclad oath. The man who had been caught crying just moments before had vanished, replaced by a focused, determined figure using his colossal power for a singular, private act of grace. The applause he normally craved meant nothing now. Only the fragile smile of a boy named Michael mattered. He punched in the private number for Fred de Cordova, the executive producer, interrupting a late-night production meeting. Fred answered, his voice sharp with professional exhaustion. "Johnny, is everything all right? You never call this late." "It is now, Fred," Carson said, his voice flat, containing an edge of command Fred rarely heard. "I have a situation, a special request. The security and schedule implications are irrelevant. You will make this happen first thing tomorrow afternoon, during the downtime between the band rehearsal and the evening taping." Carson then explained the story of Arthur Hayes and the 12-word note in a voice that was low, emotional, and utterly uncompromising. He revealed the private heartbreak of the mail clerk whose son was in a fight he could not win. Fred, the seasoned, cynical producer, remained silent on the other end, his own professionalism dissolving under the weight of the story. "I want the boy, Michael, brought to Studio One tomorrow," Johnny instructed. "I want his mother, his father, Arthur, to be with him. I want them to have a full private run of the place, clear the stages, Ed, Doc, the crew. Anyone who is around must be instructed to treat this boy like visiting royalty, not an attraction. And tell Ed and Doc this is the most important 10 minutes of their careers. They are to make it look like a pure accident, but they are to pour their genuine human warmth into that boy. This is not for public consumption, Fred. This is for Arthur, and this is for Michael. It must be quiet. It must be personal. It must be seamless." Fred, recovering slightly, started to raise procedural concerns. "Johnny, security, the network, we can't just shut down the entire operation for anyone. It's impossible to coordinate on such short notice." Carson's voice hardened. "I own this show, Fred. The Tonight Show exists to make people laugh when they need it most. This boy is the absolute definition of most. I am not asking, I am telling you. Michael and Arthur Hayes get the finest, most personal afternoon this studio can provide. If the network pushes back, you tell them they can discuss it with me. Understood?" The silence on the line was the sound of a king exercising his absolute, non-negotiable sovereignty. "Understood, Johnny," Fred finally conceded, his voice subdued. "It will be done. But we can keep it after the taping, safer that way." "No," Johnny countered firmly. "It will happen tomorrow afternoon. And here is the most important part, Fred. Arthur Hayes and his son do not know that I personally arranged any of this. Arthur is my employee, and he is a proud man. He thinks this gift is going through the regular mail system. Let him believe the tour is a standard favor arranged through the mailroom, nothing more. This has to be a gesture of quiet grace, not a public stunt or an uncomfortable favor. From the boss, Johnny hung up the phone before Fred could object further. He stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle again, feeling the 12 words of the small, ailing boy resonate in the empty corridor. The plan was set. Tomorrow, the most powerful man in television would move the entire machinery of The Tonight Show, not for a head of state or an Oscar winner, but for one 9-year-old boy and his heartbroken mail clerk father. It was an act of profound, secret humanity. The immense, chaotic engine of Studio One, usually focused only on its celebrity broadcast, had just been redirected by the will of one man, preparing for a secret, sacred afternoon where laughter would be the only medicine that mattered. Michael Hayes arrived at NBC Studio One that Tuesday afternoon, believing he was just seeing his father's workplace, a routine mailroom tour. But the moment he stepped onto the polished floor, he felt an almost sacred silence around him. This was not a chaotic television studio, it was a cathedral of dreams, held breathlessly quiet for a courageous 9-year-old boy. Michael was small for 9, pale from his relentless battle with his heart condition, but his eyes were shining with pure excitement. Arthur, the mail clerk, followed alongside, a nervous wreck in his staff uniform, terrified of taking time away from his shift. He had no idea the grand scope of the favor he was receiving. The tour guide, clearly under strict orders, led them through corridors that were suspiciously empty, making the experience feel tailored, private, and immensely special. Near the green room, the impossibly famous Ed McMahon just happened to be walking by. Ed didn't just wave, he knelt down to Michael's eye level, telling him he heard he was the greatest fan in California, and spent 5 full minutes comparing Michael's tiny, hand-carved toy with his own fancy gold watch. Moments later, as they walked past the massive soundstage doors, the legendary Doc Severinson's brassy laugh echoed down the hall. Doc, his face crinkling in a warm smile, waved Michael over to his desk, letting the boy hold his trumpet, and then playing 4 bars of "Here's Johnny" just for him. The tour culminated on the main stage itself, starkly lit and silent. Michael gasped. The guide encouraged Michael to sit behind the famous curved desk, the spot where Carson reigned supreme. Michael, looking smaller than ever in the huge chair, clutched the tiny wooden microphone he had carved. Then came the secret gift. The stage manager, standing just out of sight, flipped a switch. The gigantic teleprompter monitor, which usually scrolled Carson's monologue, suddenly illuminated. It wasn't a script, but a single, handwritten message displayed in bold, careful text. "Dear Michael, I got your gift. It made my day. Now I have a secret for you. You are the only person who gets to sit in my chair when I am not here. Because you are the most courageous kid I know. You reminded me that the best jokes are the ones that make a heart feel better. Thank you for showing me what really matters. You are the best co-host I never had. Keep that smile bright. JC." The note, delivered through the impersonal machinery of television, felt like the warmest, most intimate confession. Michael just stared at the screen, tears of pure, unadulterated joy streaming down his face. Arthur, watching from the wings, finally understood the magnitude of the secret kindness his boss had engineered. This wasn't a tour, it was a blessing. This was the secret, sacred moment, held perfectly private for a father, a mother, and an ailing boy. But the quiet grace of that afternoon was just the prelude. The next time the cameras rolled, this hidden act of humanity was about to explode into public view. If this story of secret kindness touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to remember that the greatest celebrity moments often happen when the cameras are off. The famous opening theme music, "Here's Johnny," blared through Studio One. The audience erupted in their trained standing ovation, but the man everyone was waiting for was nowhere to be seen, still talking quietly to Ed in the darkened wings. When Johnny Carson finally walked onto the stage, he wasn't carrying cue cards or a stack of witty one-liners. He was carrying a small wooden truth. The applause felt hollow as Johnny approached his desk. He set the small, hand-carved wooden microphone gently next to his coffee mug and let the silence lengthen until it was palpable, broken only by the soft whir of the cameras. Ed McMahon, sensing the gravity, offered only a muted laugh. "Folks," Johnny began, his voice soft, lacking its usual boom. "We're going to do something a little different tonight. I'm going to skip the monologue. Tonight, I want to talk about the mail, and about the quiet people." The audience shifted nervously. Johnny continued, holding up the little wooden object so the camera knew exactly where to focus. The lens zoomed in tight, projecting the imperfect sculpture onto millions of television sets. "2 nights ago," Johnny said, speaking slowly, "I stumbled across one of the most honest moments I have ever witnessed in this building. It didn't happen under the lights. It happened in the quiet part of the studio, where the important work gets done by people you never see." He explained that the man who handled the mountain of mail was hiding a pain that dwarfed show business stress. He spoke of finding that man weeping, holding the simple gift. "This came from a 9-year-old boy," Johnny continued, his voice catching slightly. "A little boy who is fighting a condition that is robbing him of his precious time. Yet he used his limited strength to carve this microphone for me." The audience was dead silent now. This wasn't comedy, it was an unscripted moment of raw humanity. Johnny looked down at the wood, losing his legendary composure. He paused, gathering his strength. "The man who brought this mail to me, his son wrote me a note. And tonight, I need to read you those words, because they reminded me what this whole big, ridiculous enterprise is actually for." Johnny lifted the small, crumpled piece of paper, the 12 words of a brave 9-year-old boy, and held it up for the cameras. The set lights seemed to dim, focusing the world entirely on the fragile note and the suddenly vulnerable man holding it. He took a deep, shuddering breath, his lips hovering over the child's handwriting. The entire studio held its breath, suspended in a moment of public, profound anticipation, waiting for the words that would make the king of late night completely break down on air. The cameras didn't stay on Johnny, they focused on the audience, every face a mirror of profound, shared shock, waiting for the devastating words that held the power to stop the most famous late-night show in the world. This wasn't a celebrity drama, this was a moment of public reckoning. Johnny Carson finally took that shuddering breath, his voice barely a whisper, yet magnified by the microphones of Studio One. He read the words written by the 9-year-old boy, Michael Hayes. "I made you this for the laughter I hear when I'm too tired to laugh." The studio broke. Ed McMahon openly lowered his head onto his hand. His signature laugh was replaced by silent sorrow. Doc Severinsen and the crew stood frozen, their professionalism abandoned as they faced an undeniable, televised truth. Johnny Carson himself couldn't continue. He pulled the note away, his eyes glistening with tears, and placed it and the wooden microphone carefully on the desk. "You see," he said, his voice thick and rough, "we measure success here in numbers. But this boy, this courageous, small hero who is struggling against an impossible illness, reminded me that success has nothing to do with fame. It is about those 12 words. It is about finding the strength to lift someone up when you yourself are fading." He spoke of Arthur, the invisible man, and of all the quiet workers who anchor the world. He redefined the show's purpose, telling the audience, "We are here to bring a smile to the man who needs it to survive another day, and who needs it so his son knows he's still strong." In the empty, brightly lit mailroom, Arthur Hayes collapsed into his chair. He was watching the show, weeping openly now, not from sorrow, but from a fierce, overwhelming gratitude that his boss had sacrificed his dignity for the private tragedy of his son. The audience, finally understanding the profound nature of the unscripted moment, rose to their feet. This was a standing ovation for humanity, a roar of collective catharsis. The camera held steady on the host, who wiped his face, nodded once, and signaled for the break. The show cut to commercial on the peak of that genuine emotional wave, but the real show, the one that would change 3 lives forever, was only just beginning. Behind the closed doors of the dressing room, we all have those unseen heroes, the people who silently gave us strength when we needed it most. Drop a comment below and tell us about a time someone made you feel seen when you felt like you mattered least. When the camera lights went dark for the commercial break, the immense emotional energy of the studio exploded, with panicked producers swarming the stage. But Johnny Carson, his face pale and serious, simply pushed past them all. He sent a single stagehand with one urgent instruction. Find Arthur Hayes, bring him to my dressing room immediately. Arthur, still standing numbly in the mailroom, saw the young page approaching. The page didn't even know Arthur's name, but he knew the urgency in Carson's voice. Arthur Hayes, Mr. Carson wants you, now. The invisible man was suddenly the most important person in the building. Arthur was led up to the second floor, toward the legendary inner sanctum. Carson was waiting for him. He was standing, still in his suit and tie, looking intensely focused. Arthur started to speak, a jumbled apology pouring out, but Johnny cut him off. Stop, Arthur, you have nothing to apologize for, Johnny said. You showed me more truth tonight than I've seen in 30 years of television. You showed me the purpose of all this. Johnny stepped forward and pulled his mail clerk into a firm, deeply felt embrace. You are a father, Arthur, Johnny murmured, and I understand. Stepping back, Johnny went straight to the heart of the matter. Michael is going to get the best care available, Arthur. The experimental treatments, the specialists, whatever is necessary. You will stop worrying about the cost right now. Arthur stood stunned, tears returning. Mr. Carson, I can't. We couldn't possibly accept that kind of charity. The bills are massive. I didn't offer charity, Johnny corrected, his gaze intense. I offered an obligation. Michael gave me a gift, 12 words, that changed the way I see my own life. I am simply squaring the bill. From this moment on, your job is secure. Your health benefits are comprehensive, and all of Michael's care will be handled by an anonymous fund established tonight. Johnny wrote his personal, unlisted phone number and pressed it into Arthur's hand. You call this number day or night. If there is a problem with his care, with the hospitals, with anything, you call me. You call me. He then gripped Arthur's shoulder, his expression hardening slightly. You must promise me one thing, Arthur. You tell absolutely no one about this conversation. This is a private debt of honor between two fathers. The moment it becomes public, it becomes a stunt, and Michael's dignity is the only thing we must protect. Arthur nodded, unable to speak. He finally managed a whisper. Thank you, sir. You gave my son a chance. The two men shook hands, sealing a solemn, hidden vow that would bind the king of late night and his mail clerk together forever, a secret act of grace hidden beneath the bright lights of celebrity. The promise was made, setting the stage for the final, heartbreaking outcome that only Arthur would ever know. The cameras that broadcast that emotional moment of national silence eventually went dark. The applause faded, and life on The Tonight Show returned to its polished, witty routine. But for three people, Johnny Carson, Arthur Hayes, and his son, Michael, everything had fundamentally, irrevocably changed. The final chapter of their hidden story was written over the next several quiet, sacred months. Thanks to the mysterious, anonymous donor, Michael Hayes spent his final months not in the sterile anonymity of a public ward, but in specialized comfort. He received cutting-edge care, spent afternoons in a sunlit conservatory, and was free from the shadow of astronomical bills. Arthur and his wife finally got to spend time with their son without the relentless, crushing weight of financial anxiety. Michael was weak, but he was filled with joy, often looking down at the small wooden microphone he had made, a tangible connection to the great man who had seen him. Arthur kept his oath of silence. He returned to the mailroom, sorting packages, never once speaking of the private promise made in Carson's dressing room. But the bond was still there. Occasionally tucked into the internal mail slot for Arthur's desk, he would find a small, folded piece of paper, sometimes just a note reading, "How's the co-host?" or simply, "Laughter is the best medicine." Arthur would pocket the note, his eyes moistening, a silent conversation passing between the king and the clerk. Michael passed away peacefully 6 months after his private tour of Studio One. He left this world curled up in his own bed, his small, fragile fingers closed tightly around the little, hand-carved wooden microphone. It was the last thing he touched, the reminder of the man who had given his final days dignity and delight. The news was relayed privately to Johnny Carson through Fred de Cordova, who simply passed a single, folded note to the host right before the start of a monologue. Johnny read it, nodded once, placed it carefully in his desk drawer, and went out to make 20 million people laugh. The tragedy never touched the broadcast, but the event changed the man forever. Johnny Carson continued to host The Tonight Show for many more years, but those who knew him said he was quieter, more reflective. He started a private philanthropic foundation, entirely anonymous, that funded research for pediatric heart issues for decades. No one knew where the millions came from until his own private papers were reviewed many years later. And what of the wooden microphone? It was sent back to Carson by Arthur, who included a single letter. It was found decades later in the back of Carson's most private drawer, right next to the 12-word note Michael had written. Arthur's final revelation was simple. "Thank you for seeing my son." That small wooden toy and those 12 words gave him a reason to fight just a little longer, and they gave me back my strength. The little, imperfect wooden microphone became Carson's most prized possession. He kept it in a locked case in his office. It served as a silent, powerful monument to the most important truth he ever learned, that fame and fortune mean nothing if you fail to acknowledge the suffering of the invisible people around you. Johnny Carson was a king who sat on a throne of comedy, but he was crowned by a small wooden toy carved by a 9-year-old boy whose last wish was to make his father smile. That, in the end, was the greatest legacy of the King of Late Night. That moment of unscripted truth, when Carson allowed his heart to finally break, is what defines legacy. If this story about the quiet courage of Arthur, Michael, and Johnny Carson reminded you what truly matters, please hit like on this video. And don't miss our next chapter in Hollywood's human history. Be sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell.